Yeah, it's a great pleasure to be here. I remember coming to Socitm meetings sort of decades ago and talking about the digital agenda that we wanted to do. And I think some colleagues felt that Manchester City Council would allow its officers to go to Star Trek conventions rather than thinking about the future. Just to put a bit of context, Manchester Digital Development Agency has been around for 10 years. We were originally the technology team of economic development. And 18 months ago, the city decided to try and bring together everyone working on digital, in ICT, in comms, in customer services, and in economic development, and indeed in employment and skills, to try and bring that together in one section so that we weren't trying to build a smart place, which is Manchester, in terms of fantastic cluster of digital companies, without that interacting with the city trying to rebuild its digital presence. And it's been great that we've done things like Responsive Web, and we won the Lobby Award this year. But let's be honest, really, for the 20 years up until that point, there were two real silos. One was called internal and one was called external. And we put a lot of effort into regenerating the city and building that digital presence, but that really didn't have the impact that we wanted internally. And I think that's changing very much now. This is focused on smart cities. All smart places don't get hung up with the city's word. A small, much smaller local authority can be a very smart place indeed. It's just that we're part of this network of smart cities. And what really interests me about that is there's genuinely no consensus on this. It is a really contested idea. There are a lot of big suppliers who say, smart city, we've got a box here, we want in. And if you just pay us, you just take it out of the box and you've got a smart city. It's fantastic. New technology, new infrastructure. And I don't think we quite buy that, because in a city like Manchester, which has made great strides in spite of the recession, even recently, where 1/3 of the adults are not in work, where we have the highest rates of child poverty and mortality of anywhere in the country, you can't be a smart place without smart people. You really have to make sure you invest, whether that's in your own staff or, more importantly, and in your residents. And so if you do nothing else, even if it winds you up, as it's wound up a number of my colleagues, read this book. Anthony Townsend, who works for the wonderfully named Institute for the Future, I bet you can't guess which state of America it's based, yep, California, he has really looked at the way that cities are trying to reach out to the emerging digital communities, that the way that they're trying to very much innovate not only their economic environments, but also their administrative and organisation environments. And it will probably inspire you and annoy you in equal stages, but I really believe it's the best book that's trying to put over this idea so far. So to Manchester, I think we're quite clear what it's about. It's about transformation. We have to transform our services, we have to transform our economy, we have to transform our skill base. And as I say, while we've made, I think, great strides in that, we've got an awful long way to go. And for us, it is very much about, it's a bit of a riff on Richard Florida's technology talent and tolerance, innovation, creativity and diversity. That's what makes the place tick. And while we've done a lot, certainly in economic development, to nurture innovation and creativity, maybe we've become, or we became until relatively recently, a bit of an island that hadn't learnt those lessons in-house, that hadn't really trusted staff to come up with really new ideas and encourage them and incubate new ideas within the city administration, in the same way that we've invested millions in incubating new ideas for business outside of the city. And I think that idea of bringing that innovation in-house, and there's a model called Living Labs which you can look at, and that's not what I want to talk about today, I think is now beginning to really pay off, and the move away from traditional project management to much more agile systems of organisation and governance really are beginning to help. And there are some key policy drivers in this. Certainly from an economic development point of view, the digital agenda has always been about smart growth. The problem is that you can have smart growth without that growth being particularly inclusive or sustainable. We can have smart growth by growing business, by growing jobs in the city, which are entirely met from, which are entirely taken up by people moving to the city, which is good. I think we still are the only city that has grown in the last 20 years. We've grown from just over 430,000 population to 505,000 population. But increasingly, many of the jobs we do create are taken by people commuting ever greater distances, and that is not sustainable. Which is why we say that smart growth also has to be inclusive and sustainable growth. As the kind of biggest centre for internet infrastructure outside of London, Manchester has also had this overheating syndrome where Electricity North West say we just can't guarantee the energy supplies to the science park where a lot of that infrastructure around Telecity and other companies is based. Well, we can, but if you could give us 2.5 million for a new substation up front, that would help. And should that be the way that we have to respond to these developments? Sustainability, making digital work for the green agenda, but also greening digital and IT is equally important. So those drivers are what are really kind of taking us forward. And that's why, as I say, 18 months ago, we brought all this together into a digital strategy for the city, a local digital agenda, which focused on these 5 main areas. Today, I really want to talk about access and connectivity and the way it links in to the skills agenda. And as you know, we're one of the super connected cities, and we've got fantastic vouchers to give away to people. And, we've got some wireless going into public buildings. But I think some of our aspirations, as our colleagues in Birmingham had, of making a public service network, which we might actually have owned, or at least co-owned, and shared that investment in and taken out next generation access to everyone, let's say we're a little bit frustrated with that. And it is important, because it's true, as my colleagues in the DCMS said last week at a meeting we're both speaking at, for most people broadband's fine. But there are 2 parts where it's not fine. One is in terms of innovation, where cities like Amsterdam and Barcelona are building terabit networks for testing new services. And the other place that's not acceptable is in terms of the inclusive agenda. We know from our school rolls that 60% of parents in our regeneration areas, the poorer areas of the city, and that means 75% of the housing stock in Manchester, make it clear that they do not have or use a landline. Sure, they have a mobile phone, and often, usually a smartphone. But if you've tried to fill in the new universal credit application, even on the smartest phones, you'll know it's a challenge. And when we were discussing this last week, a colleague from a certain large mobile company got said, yes, but the form's the problem. And I'm going, for it's true actually, yes, we ought to be thinking about responsive forms, even for universal credit. But while we do wait for hell to freeze over, I suggest that we do need to think about ways that we engage people. We're working, for example, with the housing sector to bring truly accessible wireless to the mass of tenants in the States. And that idea of utility, when we open new social housing, we don't go, well, there is a light switch from a generator, but it would take us a bit of time to get the electricity in, or the gas, or the water, or the sewage, and it should be a utility. So that's something we're working on quite strongly. I'll come back to that before I finish. So outreach campaigns, I know a number of local authorities like us have launched Go On campaigns as part of the national perspective. We've been very successful, 1,200 people signed up to be digital champions. And again, that's fantastic, but this is the telling statistic. 67,000 adults in Manchester, that's 17.5% of the adult population, are completely offline. And about the same number, when you press them further, say they're online, but when you push them, they go, yeah, my brother's daughter lives around the corner and she helps me. So that's probably 1/3 of the adult population in Manchester who are not connected. And you compare that statistic, which is still not that bad in some ways, 2/3 of the adult population connected, and you then look at why only 1/3 of residents use our online channels. So there's something missing there. And while that's an issue of equity for us, it's also a business opportunity. Because if you can double the number of people using online services, whether that's just the efficiencies that we want to make in terms of service delivery, but think of the partnership with value-added suppliers, if they could be part of some kind of public-private partnership set of arrangements which really drive up online traffic all across the board. So that's another a compelling reason why it's important for us. And so the Manchester Living Lab, which is, we were one of the founders of the Living Lab movement 7 years ago, with places like Helsinki, Barcelona. There's now more than 300 mainly across Europe, also around the world. But the Living Lab methodology, which is about getting research and development work out of the lab and into the street and making sure we engage residents and users in this kind of user-driven sort of open innovation, is a whole methodology that's really helped us speed up that change. And again, I'm not going to talk about that in any detail. What I do want to focus on is one really practical project that we've been supporting over the past 3 years. There were a number of developers, they themselves call themselves geeks, so this is no insulting term, who were running various user groups, .NET, Drupal, Ruby on Rails, Arduino, Hackman, Build Your Own Robot, you name it. And every time we saw them, we saw a little piece of what was happening in terms of the digital community more widely, both business and users. And they got themselves together and rented a ramshackle building in our northern quarter, our creative building, and set up the Manchester Digital Lab. And there's now more than 70 user groups meet there, and a lot of cross-production between people from the grassroots media industry, people making films and radio stories, and a new generation of multimedia blogs. And they've set up their own training service called the Omniversity, and they're now getting mainstream funding through skills organisations, European Social Fund, and they've had about 2,000 people through their doors in the last 2 years. And it's that kind of creative space, including things like code clubs in primary schools, working with 9 and 10-year-olds. It's that kind of practical engagement with people, that digital literacy is no longer about being able to use the Microsoft suite. It's actually about understanding what's behind all this, about being safe online. It's about coding, it's about building an app. I mean, going into primary schools and working with 9 and 10-year-olds and go, would you like to learn some IT? Mm. Would you like to build your own app? You know, so there's a way that we need to look at the skills agenda as about being as much about inspiration and aspiration as about the practical skills, although both are very, very important. And here's an example of what can be achieved. Manchester's Amy Mather, now 14, she started coding when she was 11, has just won European Digital Girl of the Year award. And that's her with Neelie Kroes, the European Commissioner for the Digital Agenda, a few weeks ago. And I just love the quote in the newspaper. It says, she teaches older pupils how to code during her school lunch breaks and with the Manchester Girl Geeks. Now that's the kind of investment we want in the talent of tomorrow, and it can't start early enough. I also want to talk about the digital landscape. If we're going to be digital places, then we may have to begin to do things ourselves. Whether in rural areas like broadband for the rural north, where, you know, farmers do know how to dig trenches and put fibre in it. Community fibre, not a million miles from here in Westminster, where housing organisations, social housing organisations are getting together with the council, the private sector, to run their own fibre and wireless build and provide a complete end-to-end service of internet, TV and back office services for the housing organisations. And in Manchester, working with self-said geeks to build environmental sensors using Arduino technology for 1/10 of the cost that the cheapest sensor can be bought. That's a way of not only instrumenting our cities, but also engaging people in how it's done. And I just want to finish on some future things. Digital manufacturing, 3D printing. I know there's some hilarious articles about how you can spend 1,500 quid for a digital printer and then try and print off your own presents, and they're all crap, and you could have bought them down the pound shop for about several quid. But nevertheless, there's some really interesting stuff happening around digital manufacturing. A camera maker or house maker by Dutch architects in Amsterdam, which we went to visit a few weeks ago, have built the world's biggest mobile 3D printer, which basically prints sections of houses. which can be built. They can be clad and pipes going and so on. Now, solar powered version in developing world, in a crisis, being able to print houses that can be put up in a couple of days. That kind of thing, if we think that 10 years hence, if just about all small businesses and many homes have this kind of technology, what are we doing now in our schools to plan for that? I mean, how many schools in your authority are running 3D printing courses for young people and stuff about those jobs for the future? None, you know. Oh, well, one, brilliant. Award afterwards, tell me about it, please. But the challenge for me, coming from an economic development point of view, as this starts, as we relocalise production because of these technologies, do we praise people, do we give people awards for doing that and encourage it, potential new source of jobs and skills? Or when we receive the first complaint that there's something smelly going on in next door's garage, and should I call the police? Or is it an enforcement issue? So these are the challenges that the digital landscape, if we're going to be smart places, that the challenges are much broader than you might think of. And last slide, this is to use the recipe. We had a bit of a session the other week saying, well, think of a recipe. So you take some really innovative independent organisations like Union Learn, like the Institute of Community Reporters, which has come out of the Community Journalists Initiative in Manchester, Manchester Digital, which represent 400 SMEs, and Mad Lab. You know, mix that together with some organising oil, get them introduced to the geeks and hacktivists doing that, add a mix of social media, think open access, open networks, open systems, and optionally you can add some spice of open source. I have to be careful because when it's open source, I feel like, yeah, and they're like, ooh. So, you know, that's the added spice. And organise a digital bake-off or two. Apps challenges, hackathons, co-production days. And to be a bit cynical, why as a local authority should we spend 100 grand on a procurement exercise when for 10,000 quid's worth of prizes in our apps challenge, we've got more innovative ideas, 4 of which we're putting into production now, and supporting those who came up with them to set up their own business than we ever did another way. So it's, again, great for some, very threatening for others. But it's what's needed, because when we ran the Digital Challenge campaign all those years ago, 7 years ago, we talked about innovation through inclusion, and inclusion through innovation. And I would argue that the innovation agenda, the deliberately seeding new ideas, however disruptive they are, of incubating new ways of delivering services, and there's been some very interesting discussions with government digital services about this, and then if the legacy system doesn't fit, shut it down, bin it, scrap it. That may be one of the ways that we have to begin to approach this kind of innovation if we're truly going to be smart cities and smart places. And that's why I think the result there is one of happiness. Thank you very much.